Hey guys, Ian here, and welcome to another episode of my Batman's Rogue Gallery. And as it is Halloween week, there was only one really clear choice as to who got the fourth entry into my Rogues Gallery, and that is, of course, Dr. Jonathan Crane, aka the Scarecrow. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time discussing the character, and then I'm going to go into some of the design choices and aspects of the painting, and why I've chosen to portray him in the way that I have. So there have been a few different versions of Scarecrow over the years. Certainly one of the ones that I remember the most is obviously the one from the animated series back in the 90s. But probably one of my favourite portrayals of him is that from the Arkham game series. I think they really captured a lot of the malice and the menace that he brings with him. So depending on which canon that you're looking at, Dr. Jonathan Crane is either the professor of psychology at Gotham University, or he's a criminal psychologist at Arkham Asylum. He's kind of obsessed with fear and how fear affects his patients and his students, and starts getting absorbed into his own experiments and starts doing some fairly horrific things to incite as much fear in his subjects as possible. And in doing so develops this fear gas, this gas which just creates an overwhelming sense of terror in his victims, making their worst nightmares just come to life around them. His experiments usually starts off quite low-key, maybe just one or two victims, but he ends up trying to take his experiments city-wide and just infect the whole of Gotham with this overwhelming sense of fear and dread and terror, which is obviously where kind of Batman comes in to come and stop them, save the day. And obviously Batman's the only person who is able to develop an antidote to the fear gas, so that's always handy for him, I guess. But it was that sense of fear and dread that I really wanted to capture with this painting. So from the very beginning I knew I was going to have to try and use pretty much every trick in my arsenal to try and get this overwhelming sense of fear and dread, this atmosphere into this picture. And probably more so than with any other character in this Rogues Gallery, the atmosphere was going to be really, really important. So I had to push everything. So before I even started working on the Scarecrow himself, I was working on the overall composition of the scene. In particular, things like the worm's eye view. It's not quite a worm's eye view, but it's a very low angle looking up into the scene, so everything seemed much bigger than you are. Coupled with this very extreme perspective that I've used, sort of a 2-point thing, which is causing like this fisheye lens. Those two things together create a very unsettling scene because it's such an unnatural viewpoint, very unnatural perspective to us from normal. I also brought in some various phobia-driven concepts from the spiders, so I apologize to any arachnophobes who are watching. There is the giant spider in the background just sort of emerging from the shadows, and I wanted it to almost look like it was being formed by pieces of the corridor itself, so its legs actually become the doors in the sides of the corridor, and its body and its head are just sort of emerging out of the shadows like they're being formed from the shadows themselves. But the other thing that I wanted to create was this feeling of claustrophobia in the scene. And using the corridor and this 2-point perspective is going to help push that feeling of claustrophobia. But another thing that I've done is I've tried to keep as much of the detail of the piece to the very center. So you've got the sign above the spider, you've got the spider coming down into Dr. Crane, and then you've got his hand with the fear gas and such, all down the very center of the painting with not so much detail going on at the sides, and that helps to add to that claustrophobic feel. Especially when coupled with that perspective, making the corridor feel like it's almost wrapping around the viewer as well. All these things together, I feel, really kind of push that sense of just enclosed and uncomfortable and claustrophobic space, and I'm really happy with how those aspects all came together to portray that. Once again, with this entry in the Rogues Gallery, I've decided to use a Dutch angle as well. And because I decided to use it quite late into the painting, you'll actually see how it changes the composition and makes things go from, although it's got this extreme perspective, it still feels quite natural, but as soon as I tilt it over, you'll notice how much just changing the angle of the piece dramatically changes the feeling of the overall painting. Now, I had tried several different design ideas for the Scarecrow, and I actually went with a fairly simplistic version of him. You'll see that many versions of him have all sorts of pipes and syringes and gas bombs and grenades and wraps and all sorts of things all cluttering the image, but what I wanted to go for was maybe in early stages of the Scarecrow's development. So maybe he's just got his fear gas and gas mask on, and then a very simple Scarecrow costume over the top, and it actually made him feel a little bit more disturbing, especially when I decided to leave his legs bare. One of the early designs that I had for him had his legs all covered in wraps and hessian and things, but when I chose to leave his legs bare, it actually made him feel that little bit more disturbing, and I really liked it. So I decided to keep that idea of having these just bare legs, and maybe he's not wearing all that much underneath this Scarecrow costume. That really made him just this really creepy guy, as well as this fear-driven maniac. The massive grin on his mask with the respirators coming out of the mouth and just these crazed eyes in behind it. I wondered about having lenses from a gas mask in behind the mask instead, but having these crazed human eyes coming out from it as well just really lent itself to this kind of disturbing concept for this character behind it. He already has this psychological, fear-driven character in the same kind of way as Hannibal Lecter does. You wouldn't expect a professor of psychology or anything like this to be this crazed maniac, and yet he is. And that's one of the things which really lends itself, and I wanted to get across some idea that just behind this mask there's this human, this actual person. And that's something which I find is missing with some of the designs of the Scarecrow, is that he looks like he's a monster character like, say, Killer Croc or something like that, whereas actually he is a human being, he is a professor, an intelligent man, and yet he's just a maniac. And reminding the viewer that he is a human being really helps add to that disturbing aesthetic that I wanted to go for. So towards the end of the painting, I decided to really burn out the light, creating this very unnatural lighting as well, creating this sort of a sepia tone, like maybe the color is just draining out of the viewer's vision as he becomes overwhelmed by the fear gas. It also helped to push some of those shadowy aspects back into the painting and really helped exaggerate the idea that this spider creature in the background is coming out of the shadows, being formed by the shadows themselves. And I wanted to reflect that with the snakes on the floor, so I wanted them to more represent snakes, like the shadows are creeping along the floor in this serpentine fashion. I added in sort of vague scales and vague eye shapes and things to them, so if you look at them with great care, you'll realize they're not at all anatomically correct. They look kind of derpy in a way, but from a distance they add to this creepy aesthetic. I added in a lot more spiders to the scene as well, like maybe they're breaking off from the shadows and crawling up the walls and coming to enclose around you. And then just to add to the whole thing and bring everything together, I brought in sort of the classic hands coming out of the shadows down and around the walls, and this disturbing kind of demon face creeping out across the ceiling above the spider. Blood splatters up and down the corridor. Maybe they're there, maybe they're just being created by the fear gas, who knows? I'm really happy with the way that this piece came together at the end. I think the last few stages of it really helped solidify that atmosphere that I was going for, and I'm really happy with the result. Even though Photoshop corrupted the file right at the end, so I wasn't able to add some of the final effects I would have liked to, it still ended up pretty good, and I still had the footage, so you still get this final video. Anyway guys, I hope you have enjoyed this video. If you have, please do leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't, happy Halloween, and as always, take care, and I will see you next time.